Welcome to Mindshift. I'm bringing in today's episode 19 of our secular Bible study series, Psalms, and I'm very excited to talk about this book. It is probably the most popular book in the Old Testament, maybe even in the Bible, depends on what kind of utility you're looking for from this book. But it has many misconceptions, many things that are missed by even the believer, and many interesting points about how it was put together and its intended purpose. So I'm excited to get into all of it. Many of you joined at Job, and I really appreciate that. Please go back and start in Genesis and come on through. I understand that certain books are going to be much more interesting than others, but I think each book deserves to be understood in its context because it plays its part in the whole contribution. These books weren't picked at random. These books weren't just chosen on happenstance. They go together, they go in a certain order, they build off one another, they reflect each other, etc. It helps us understand what the goal of these people who put this together is, how it's currently being utilized by the church, and of course, from a secular perspective, what I think is wrong, what I think is harmful, how it falls apart, how it proves that these words are not divinely inspired, etc. So again, Genesis, very popular. People love the creation story. Exodus, every Christian knows about it. Of course, the 10 plagues, how exciting, how terrifying. But Psalms is used, I would say, by the believer much more than others. This is a book that gets put into devotional form. Get through the Psalms in a month, get through the Psalms in a year, read one Psalm a day. They do this with Proverbs as well. But the idea is that these books that are a little more poetic, you can have a little more of an intimate experience with God. You can have your own private time of looking at something that is either someone lamenting, which you can relate to, or someone giving praise and gratefulness, which you can relate to. Which leads me to my point that this book is extremely structured. Not to the point of proving the divine, which I would encourage all of you to go and watch my least watched video. I don't know why. Guys, I think it's a good video. It is Counting on Confusion. And I react to someone making the claim that Psalms 118 proves the whole Bible is divinely inspired and perfectly put together. No, it doesn't. Watch that video. But just because it is highly structured and purposeful, and there is even some number play at work, and its process of collection and grouping and editing and redacting, etc., has been purposeful. These are not dumb writers. For the time, it's pretty darn impressive. So let me explain a little bit about what I'm talking about. First of all, you have a progression. Now, you have concepts of every different feeling and emotion that can be felt. This is a human book. This is a pouring from the heart. This is poetic in nature. We're going to hear about the good and bad, the fear and the hope, the loss and the gain, etc. But you have more of the negative at the beginning and more of the positive at the end. You have more fear and confusion leading into more gratefulness and hope. It also ends with 5 chapters that are nothing but thanksgiving. And the Psalms themselves, if you look through your Bible, are divided up into 5 sections. Book 1, Book 2, Book 3, Book 4, Book 5. Each section doesn't necessarily have its own theme, but it has more verses or psalms that are essentially representing the same kind of thing than others. There's a lot of structure, there's a lot of intrigue, there's a lot of interest. This is a book that can be manipulated and used by the believer because even within all of that structure and the narrative that we have within this poetic fashion, we have a lot of vagueness. We have a lot of inconsistencies in some of that structure, enough for people to say there's prophecy here, there's pointing to Jesus here, there's end time revelation here, there's personal utility to me here, etc. You can make this book whatever you want because it's so big, because it's so poetic, and because it's so vague. It's our largest book. It's 150 chapters. We have our longest chapter, 119, our shortest chapter, 117. The middle chapter, 118, is the middle spot of the entirety of the Bible if you have the right canon, if you have the right dates and the right compilation. But I digress. Again, get back to that video. And so as much as this is a color by number, it is also a choose your own adventure book. And again, I think that's what has made it so popular. You can go to the Psalms and get whatever you want out of it. Pastors do this, preachers do it, devotionals do this, etc. You really can cherry pick this book in particular above many others. If you read Numbers, it's hard not to talk about Numbers without making excuses for slavery and genocide. But if you read Psalms, you can talk about a good father, you can talk about a messianic promise, you can talk about hope for tomorrow, while completely ignoring dashing babies upon the rocks, victory cries of conquest over mass murder. Think about who writes the Psalms, which maybe I haven't covered yet, and that's going to be mainly point 2, but I'll give you a quick hint. It's not just David. About half are David, or at least attributed to him. A third are anonymous, and the other are going to be Moses and Solomon, the sons of Korah, Asaph, etc. Think about these men, these patriarchs. Yes, they're known for some great things. David's faith, Moses' endurance, Solomon builds the temple. Solomon also reinstituted slavery. David was also a murderer and a general of genocide and a mutilator. Moses was an enslaver and a genocider. These patriarchs who are going to, in their psalms of praise, brag about the horrendous things things they did for God are going to lead many of these psalms to be quite abhorrent. And you never see those get preached about from the pulpit. You never see those show up in the lovely little daily devotional. So we'll get to some of that in problematic passages. I think I've covered about everything I want to cover for the book overview, the main structure here. So let's get into point 2, which is authorship and date. Now, for the date, it was probably compiled in the post-exile period. But in terms of when each of these poems or songs were written, it spans centuries. Some of these were during the temple period, and they were literally for the chorus that was supposed to be sung on a daily basis in the temple. Some are, again, David out in the field, loving God, or hiding from Saul, afraid. Some are going all the way back to Moses and his songs of victory after crossing the sea or after defeating his enemies. So we don't have a specific date for each psalm or each even collection of the 5 books. But again, we probably had the collection in general and its general outline and amalgamation put together, again, during this post-exile period. Was there probably some edits and some redactions? For sure. We even see at the end of each of those 5 books, the 5 segments, the same exact lines, right? This is an editorial process. This is tying things together. This is making a cohesive nature. I guess the only other thing to say is one of the latest psalms that we can look at would be like Psalm 126, which specifically mentions the rebuilding of Jerusalem. So we know at least that that was when the last one or one of the last ones was written. That's definitely post-exile. So the collection would have had to happen even after that. I'm sure this was edited along the way, and who knows when it finally stopped, became solid, and then got incorporated. But it's used as teaching. Even Psalm 1 talks about the purpose of the Torah, the teaching, which generally speaking, the Torah is the first 5 books of the Bible, but this is the Torah, this is the teaching on how to worship. Getting back to the hymn book aspect of this, yes, some of the time it was meant to be used in ceremonies and rituals and temple worship, etc. But it was also ideally for the individual to understand how to connect with their God. That's all I have to say really for authorship and date. Let's move right into point 3, which is going to be historical context, background, and accuracy. I think the first thing that's important to understand about this point is just what this book is again. This is a poetic book. Poetry, almost, not necessarily, tends to be the opposite of a narrative, something that we can historically validate. It's meant to be exaggeratory in nature. It's meant to find words that encapsulate emotion over facts. And that's okay. The Bible can have its room for that. On the other side, and what's interesting is that it covers such a vast period of the Israelite timeline that we do have references to crying by the rivers of Babylon, like in Psalm 137, or again, rebuilding the walls in Psalm 126. Or of course, many of the Psalms written by David were during the monarchy period. So we have these references to the kingdoms, reflections back on Judges, songs of Moses when we are fleeing and in a kind of exile before coming in and conquering land. So we're all over the place. There are narratives at play, but they're reference points. They're not stories of those things. So there's really no corroboration to be had. There's no archaeological evidence that suggests that anything in Psalms is accurate. So we're not losing points or gaining points. It's simply something different. But it does give us a ton of context into the feelings that these people were having, how they felt about their God, what they questioned about their God, what they enjoyed about their God, what they feared about their God, what their views on worship and prayer were, how they expressed their sorrow and their sadness for their losses and their grief, what they thought about themselves as a people group, what they thought about their neighbors and their surroundings and their captors and their enemies. This is an incredible insight into a people group over the span of centuries that went through, or at least believed themselves to have gone through, quite the succession of highs and lows. So from all of those angles, it's very interesting and very insightful. Let's move straight into point 4, literary analysis. So there's a lot to break down here. First of all, there's really 4 kinds of psalms. People will say 2, and they'll say positive and negative, or they'll say lament and praise. But really, you can break this into 4 categories of psalm: praise psalms, lament psalms, thanksgiving psalms, and wisdom psalms. This is considered a wisdom book of the Bible, and Psalm 1 is a prime example of the wisdom literature aspect of it versus just the thanksgiving, the praise, or the lamenting. Psalm 1 being just right off the bat, and you probably will recognize it: "Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the wicked, nor stands in the way of sinners, nor sits in the seat of scoffers, but his delight is in the law of the Lord, and on his law he meditates day and night." It goes on. But the whole point here is we get true counsel for the individual of what is right and what is wrong, of wisdom, of discernment, etc. So again, those are our main 4 categories of psalm. We have the structural units, we have the invocation, we have the introduction, we have a conclusion, some finality at the end, and we have the body made up of the 5 sections or 5 books. Then we have our techniques. One of the main ones is parallelism, and at play, and I think this is really interesting, you have 2 forms of parallelism, synonymous and antithetical. With synonymous, you have each following line echoing the first line, if you will. Let me give you an example. Psalm 19:1, the heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky above proclaims his handiwork. Right? We're saying 2 things that are the same, but a little bit different. The heavens are doing this, and the skies are doing this, and they're both meaning something good. Verse 2 says, day to day pours out speech, and night to night reveals knowledge. Now, this is interesting. This is like some middle ground of parallelism, because we have this day to day and night to night. It's the same thing. We're using a time frame, and we're still in the same vein. We're still showing something positive. Where a better reflection of this antithetical might be, we'll go back to Psalm 1, verse 6. For the Lord knows the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked will perish, right? We have the this, then, the one thing and then the other. So parallelism is rampant, and you have this spectrum of how it's being used. There's definitely more techniques at play in Psalms than just parallelism, but again, the structure of its poetic nature is kind of this line by line, stanza by stanza, agreement or antithesis being used all the way through. And the whole purpose of using these techniques and breaking the structure down in this way is to be able to focus on the themes. So point 5, what are our main themes? We could talk about 100 different themes in Psalms. Honestly, you could pull so much from this, but the main thing is going to be to look at the structure and what we're trying to say. So we've been talking about this lament versus praise. Those are your main 2 themes, praise and worship. There's a reason that this gets dedicated time in your Sunday service. We are told from the mouth of these patriarchs, of these lovers of God, the importance of reciting back to him what a good God he is. The trust and hope that we place in him, his power, his might. The Christian mindset, praise and worship seems like such a good thing. When you get out of it, when you take those glasses off, when you look through a fresh perspective, it becomes, I think, one of the most ghastly aspects of Christianity is the idea that this God needs and requires worship. But we'll save that for point 7. So praise and worship. Theme 2 then would be the lamenting, the suffering, the nature of suffering, the dealing with suffering, the loving and trusting a God despite your suffering, despite your problems. We covered that in great detail with the book of Job, so we'll just leave it there. A third theme would be for sure morality of some sort, or at least a relationship between righteousness and wickedness. I mean, half of these Psalms are just outlining what is righteous, what is wicked, what is good, what is bad, how do you get blessed, how do you get cursed. Remember, this is not just a book of worship. This is a Torah. This is a teaching. This is a book of wisdom. This is for you not only to know and worship this God, but be able to bless him and bring him honor and glory. And that only comes through your devotion and obedience to what? To the law, to staying righteous and avoiding wickedness. We could talk about a theme of the nature of God's character, although that's debatable that it's consistent, at least to myself. We could do the importance of trust and faith. I think that's a huge theme, whether it is lamenting or it is thanksgiving or praise. It is all about the fine line of trust and faith in this God, despite where on the spectrum we are currently. So again, we could talk endlessly about themes. You could pull out each of these 150 Psalms and say, this one represents this, and here's why. And you could do 10 for each of them. I mean, it's packed with emotion and feeling and information, the ingredients of making up for yourself themes and meaning. Point 6, my least favorite point to talk about, still important, is reception and influence. And man, does this book have it. This is not a forgotten book. This is a book that has been received, a book that has been utilized, that has been promoted, that is of value and substance to almost all kinds of believers of every different denomination and sect. You know what you don't hear a lot when you talk about Psalms? Oh, that's Old Testament. That's a great excuse for Leviticus, but all of a sudden the Psalms as relevant as ever. Usually I try to break down the difference between how Judaism looks at a book and how Christians look at a book, and they're really similar here. But I mean, even within the Jewish faith, you have Psalms that are being used on a daily basis in prayers, in services, in traditional feasts and celebrations and special occasions and festivals, etc. In Christianity, Christianity, just go to your Sunday service. You're bound to hear a psalm brought up in the sermon, even if it's something from the New Testament. The Psalms are widely used by even Jesus in his teachings in the New Testament. They're reflected back on and spoke about. Much of what Jesus says on the cross is tied back into some way with a psalm that is presented. My God, why have you forsaken me? Is Jesus referencing a psalm. So you'll find it in the teaching, you'll find it in the preaching, but you'll find it in the worship service. It doesn't matter if it's Hillsong or your favorite modern Christian rap artist or whatever it is, they are going to be pulling on heavily from the Psalms. And many of them are absolutely beautiful. Again, no one is singing about the baby dashing part of Psalms. They're singing about the city on the hill. They're singing about not having fear as you walk through the valley of the shadow of death, the comfort of the Most High. Who doesn't know about Psalm 23? How often is that quoted in music, in movies, as the theme in symphonies or the basis for great works of art throughout all of history? The Psalms touch everything that is creative inside of us, and they have worked their way into every outlet that art can take. Again, it's a book that can be examined and really brought out through study. And so that leads to all kinds of adaptations, if you will, or at least commentaries, etc. Again, it's huge for everything. Going back to the composer level, you have Bernstein, Bach, Handel. We see it in the stories of Milton. We see it in the paintings of Blake. It's everywhere. The Psalms are raw. They're an open cut into the emotion of what people feel in every aspect throughout the entirety of human emotion. It's right there. One book ripe for personalization. If it's too specific, if it's not timeless, it can't be utilized by the masses. This is what Psalms does well. Yeah, sometimes we say Yahweh, sometimes we have specific names for God, but often we call him the protector here in the Psalms, the creator, the giver, the helper. This allows for that timeless aspect that people can map onto. I would say the Psalms are quoted from a secular perspective very often. I knew secular people in my life growing up that found great beauty and utility in the Psalms. So again, reception and influence, paramount. Top 5 of the Bible for sure. So let's move into our final point, split points here, 7 contradictions and problematic passages. So point 7 is going to be a little interesting here because typically we have a statement that is made and then we can compare that with a statement that is mutually exclusive. Here we have different men in different situations reacting to their God in particular ways. One might feel afraid of their God and the other might feel comforted, or even the same man at different times having these emotions. One might feel forsaken and one might feel found. One might be sinking in the mud and mire and the other is being drawn close by the staff. These are not contradictions. This is a multifaceted experience. I do think, though, it does point and it should be considered when looking at this God. Why is there this level of inconsistency? Why does he show up for some but not others? Why does he sometimes punish and sometimes forgive? And I'm not going to get into all the specific verses here. I am going to be talking in these generalities. I think it's really telling if you put this all together, if you read through the whole thing and you look at the different lives of the different men that wrote these things, to see what we've seen in all of the previous books of the Bible so far. An inconsistent nature of God, a God that fits the story trying to be told, a God to fill the gaps, a God to be a plot device that helps move the people along to what is actually happening to them. It is a people trying to make sense of their stance in life and attributing blessings and curses upon them from previous actions by this God without trying to be consistent, which if we had a real God who was truly just, he would be truly consistent in when he punishes people for, breaking the Sabbath and when he doesn't. When he has children murdered for being disobedient, and when he shows grace. When he allows a king to mess up the genocidal order, like David, and when he doesn't, like Saul. When he punishes people directly, like Saul, and when he punishes 70,000 soldiers, or the 8 wives, or the newborn baby of David. We have here and everywhere an inconsistent God, and I would just make that its own main point for contradictions. We could also look at Old versus New Testament ideas of God. I'm going to overuse this verse because I think it's one of the worst ones in the entire book of Psalms, and we'll talk about it in point 7, or maybe we'll just cover it now. But Psalm 137:9, in fact, I'll just read it to you. So let's do that. Let's mix it all together. Problematic passages and contradictions, since we're mainly talking about God's character. And that's what I cover in problematic passages. What do we read about here that leads us to think maybe this God isn't good, maybe he's not moral, if he were even indeed real. So 137:9, blessed shall he be who takes your little ones and dashes them against the rock. Backing up for context, in verse 7, remember, O Lord, against the Edomites the day of Jerusalem, how they said, lay it bare, down to its foundations. O daughters of Babylon, doomed to be destroyed. Blessed shall he be who repays you with what you have done to us. And then the verse, blessed shall be those who take your little ones and dash them against the rocks. This is a verse of vengeance. This is about killing babies, the innocent, on purpose. But my point here is, let's just compare that with verses in Matthew, like in 5:44 and 45, where we are told to pray for our enemies, to love them, to intercede for those who hurt you. This is the opposite, an inconsistent God, a problematic God, an immoral God. So if we're following this line of thinking, let's go back to Psalm 7. And verse 11 is, God is a righteous judge and a God who feels indignation every day. If a man does not repent, God will whet his sword. He has bent and readied his bow. It goes on from there about God taking daily and immediate action against wickedness and sin. Well, not always in the Old Testament, sometimes on the person, sometimes on their family, sometimes on the person and then their following generations, sometimes just on their generations. Sometimes he says he won't do it to future generations. Sometimes he says he will. Sometimes he says he won't curse parents for what their children do and children for what their parents do, but sometimes that's exactly what he does. He's supposed to be a God that is slow to anger and quick to be forgiving. So again, if we compare this with the New Testament, let's go to 2 Peter and we'll go to chapter 3, verse 9. The Lord is not slow to fulfill his promise, as someone counts slowness, but is patient toward you, not wishing that any should perish, but that all should reach repentance. He wants everyone to be saved, everyone to have a chance to encounter him and reach repentance. So much for those babies dashed on the rocks. So much for all the genocide that is remembered and boasted about in Psalms. So much for the quick daily indignation against the wicked. You can't have it both ways. You really just cannot. Let's go back to Psalm. Let's go to 39:14, I think is going to be the next one we talk about. 34:19. Many are the afflictions of the righteous, but the Lord delivers him out of them all. He keeps all his bones, not one of them is broken. Affliction will slay the wicked, and those who hate the righteous will be condemned. Right? This sounds like a fair setup of justice. The wicked are the ones who are punished. The righteous are not. They're in the midst of affliction, but they're not touched. No bone is broken. And yet this book comes right after Job, which starts with Job was perfect, blameless, and righteous. And yet God did this, and this to him. It says the righteous cry for help, and the Lord hears and delivers them out of their troubles. When Job cried out, God doubled down and gave Satan permission to afflict his entire body after he had already killed his family, all of his children. Getting more children back doesn't help with that. And it's not what the Psalm says will happen for the righteous person. In fact, it's the exact opposite. Contradiction, problematic passage. It's all together today. What about Psalm 58:10? This is a small example of what goes on through a ton of this book, and it is about vengeance. The righteous will rejoice when he sees the vengeance. He will bathe his feet in the blood of the wicked. Mankind will say, surely there is a reward for the righteous. Surely there is a God who judges on earth. This is the nature of God. This is the correct version of God. So dismiss the book entirely, or if you keep it, keep all of it. None of these half measures will do. So again, we have a God that rejoices in vengeance and wants his people to rejoice in vengeance. A God that will bathe his feet in the blood of the wicked. So much for Luke 6:27 and 28. Love your enemies, do good to those who hurt you. Bless those who curse you. Don't bless them, bathe in their blood. Come on, it's insane. Let's do a few more problematic verses. I probably won't show contradiction for each of them, although I think it's obvious through most of the Bible. Let's go to a heated chapter, and that is Psalm 109. We'll start at verse 6, and I'll read for just a minute. Appoint a wicked man against him. Let an accuser stand at his right hand. When he is tried, let him come forth guilty. Let his prayer be counted as sin. May his days be few. May another take his office. May his children be fatherless, and his wife a widow. May his children wander about and beg, seeking food far from the ruins they inhabit. inhabit. May the creditor seize all that he has. May strangers plunder the fruits of his toil. Let there be none to extend kindness to him, nor any pity his fatherless children. May his posterity be cut off. May his name be blotted out in the second generation. May the iniquity of his fathers be remembered before the Lord, and let not the sin of his mother be blotted out. Let them be found before the Lord continually, that he may cut off the memory of them from the earth. So what's the context here? This is from David, and he starts off going back to verse 1. Be not silent, O God of my praise. Bend your ear to me. Hear me. I'm about to make a big request of you. Wicked and deceitful mouths are opened against me, speaking against me with lying tongues. They encircle me with their words of hate and attack me without cause. In return for my love, they accuse me, but I give myself to prayer. So they reward me evil for good and hatred for my love. This is David asking God for vengeance. This is a man after God's own heart. That is the main description we get of David. This next best to the Messiah, this blueprint for the Christ. And what does he beg of God? It specifically goes on to how it should affect the wife and the children and the future generations for God not to forget this sin. Because what does God tell us? That he forgets sins. He throws them as far as the east is from the west to remember them no more. David says, not this guy. Remember this one. Don't forget. Continue to harass. Continue to take from him. Don't even let other men have sympathy for his children. And it's not condemned. This is wisdom literature. This is Torah. This is teaching. This is how we handle those who, when we're in power, go against us. Do you think David was blameless? Do you know anything about this man? Right? That's the excuse. Oh, well, he's faulty. He's human. This isn't God himself. Oh, then he's faulty enough that he shouldn't be making this request of his enemies about how blameless he is and how they deserve destruction, even their little children. Again, you can't have it both ways. Let's go to Psalm 69, verse 22. Another curse, and that's what this is. This is like a spell from David. Let their own table before them become a snare, and when they are at peace, let it become a trap. Let their eyes be darkened so that they cannot see, and make their loins tremble continually. Pour out your indignation upon them, and let your burning anger overtake them. May their camp be a desolation, let no one dwell in their tents. Add to them punishment upon punishment. May they have no acquittal from you. Let them be blotted out of the book of the living. Let them not be enrolled among the righteous. He ends by saying, I am afflicted and in pain. Let your salvation, O God, set me on high. Begging that others can't be found righteous or can't even achieve or attain righteousness after wrongdoing, while he says he's in wrongdoing, he's suffering for his wrongdoing, and to remember him, to set me on high, to give him God's salvation. And we see that God has done exactly this. I won't continue to go on in this vein. There are hundreds more verses we could talk about in this very book along the exact same lines. It really does go on and on and on like this, whether it's Moses or Solomon or David or one of the anonymous Psalms, begging God to do bad towards others and begging God to have mercy on themselves. This is the book of wisdom. This is the book that you go through in your devotion. You read the pretty parts, you ignore these parts, or the pretty parts are included in these parts, right? It's that antithetical parallelism. Do this, hurt them, kill them, forget them, deny them, love me, protect me, thank you, I'm grateful. At best, if you're somehow going to rob God of his responsibility for who these psalmists are and what they say and why it's included in the canon that we're supposed to glean wisdom from, then at best, all you can say is this is a book written by narcissistic, evil men who promoted their well-being for selfish reasons over everybody else's suffering, that couldn't just leave the others alone, that had to curse them, to wish evil on them, and that this is the example we should take. So why is this book problematic? It teaches hate. It teaches vengeance, not justice. It teaches war crime. This is a book that condones everything that us in modern times in our current version of morality have said, no, that's not okay. You know, collateral damage is one thing, but we shouldn't purposely go after children and women. We shouldn't wish for offspring to be denied food, to not have anywhere to go. And yet that's what these people wanted in their conflicts, and that's what their God granted. And if you don't think he granted it, go back and watch all the other videos that I covered. Go back to the Chronicles and the Kings and the Samuels. Go watch those. Tell me this God doesn't align. And I'm not endorsing it. If you're a Christian who thinks that those things are wrong and you're speaking up, thank you. That's wonderful, but you're doing it against your God. You're doing it against your text, or you're doing it in contradiction to some of it because some of it also says some other pretty things like we talked about. But if you're going to open up your book to a nice psalm and read it for the day for some daily encouragement, what you're going to hear, because you have refused to read the second part of the antithetical parallelism, is you're going to read the part of David saying, my God, thank Thank you for remembering me. Thank you for holding me close. You put your righteous arm around me. You offer protection where I had none. You lift my spirit up and bring me to contentment. You fill my heart with joy. Oh, it's so beautiful. Look at our God. Look at how lovely. Thank you for the curses you've given my enemy. Thank you for destroying his name. Remember not to forget his sin. Hold it upon him and his household forever, and bathe with me in the blood of my enemies. Whoa. Did we just forget about the second part? That's half the book, you guys. The first part doesn't look so lovely anymore. And by the way, everything I just said is not an actual verse. So before you go and get mad, but tell me how it's not exactly the same. Tell me where I went too far in one direction. No, it's par for the course. It's like reading the diary of genocidal, narcissistic Middle Eastern warlords who praise themselves and the God that takes care of them and commit their enemies to heinous crimes and begs their God to help them with it. But because it's titled under the correct religion, you're fine with it. Islam does this exact same thing and you think it's so disgusting. What kind of verses do you think Hamas is reading? You think it's that different? But because it's Allah instead of Yahweh in the verses, all of a sudden it's evil. Is it really as simple as switching out the right name for the right God and then anything is permissible? Because that's all I see in these kinds of texts. You can say anything you want. You can think anything you want. If it's in our canon and we're told the Bible is good and it's the good news and it's basic instructions before leaving earth and it's God's divine word and he wants to impart on us wisdom and love and grace and righteousness and forgiveness and redemption, then how can it be bad? So I'll pick it up and I'll read it and I'll be ignorant and I'll act like it's innocent and I'll only read what I'm told and I'll only hear what I'm supposed to hear and I'll only interpret what I'm supposed to interpret, and anything else must just be me. It must be a heart issue. It must be confusion. It must be a context issue. Because who are you to judge God? Who are you to read words and say, this says this, so it must mean this, and if it means that, then it's bad? Who can possibly do that? You, with every other book you've ever read, with every other holy book that's ever been written, but this gets a pass. It's disgusting. So that's the book of Psalms. Once again, I have just gone off the rails at the end. Thank you for watching, though. I'm very curious to hear what you guys think about this book, how you think it fits into the vast collection of the canon. Let me know what verses you would have added for problems or contradictions. Let me know what you think I got wrong. Let me know why this book is actually good and useful and beneficial for the Christian, why it doesn't show God's character and the character of the men that he chose as leaders to be completely perverse. That's it for now. Sunday I'll have a new video for you. I'm not sure what it'll be yet. It will either be episode 1 of a series that I want to start on God and Anatomy, one of my favorite books of all time, or maybe The Genius of Yahweh, sarcasm, or something else. I'm not sure. Haven't filmed it yet. Thanks for being here. Have a wonderful day. And until next time, keep thinking.